Now, there's plenty more that we can learn about style components and how we can leverage it to build perform an app or website. And I encourage you to look at the documentation on stylecomponents.com because there's a lot more available to the package than we're talking about here, especially when you get into server-side rendering and performance of packaging handling and nice names of classes and such. But one thing I do want to mention that I sort of alluded to earlier, but we haven't really talked about up to this point, is referring to other components when creating components. So we did that. We sort of did that a little bit when we talked about the input. We were referencing the span that was adjacent to it, but the span itself is not a styled component. It's just an adjacent element. So what I want to do is just make a little fun little change in the way that we are utilizing this app and create a couple new components and have them interact with each other so we can see how that would work in practice. So what I want to do is just sort of lower the opacity of all of our elements and only up the opacity on the ones that are focused. So we're going to ignore this sort of invalid prop that we did before. In reality, if you want to mark something as invalid, you should probably do something a little bit more than just change the opacity. So I'm going to make two components. I'm going to first make a label component, which is just replace this label. It's going to serve no purpose other than to lower the opacity of these elements. And then I'm going to replace this div, this wrapping div, with a element component or a checkbox component. So let's create both of those. First, I'm going to create that label. And that's style.label. And we're just going to create a simple opacity. We're going to lower that halfway. Looks familiar. So we're going to export that. We're going to go back to our app, import, and each one of these labels is going to be replaced by that component. There we go. These are all lowered in opacity. Now, next thing you want to do is replace these div with a component called checkbox. So we're going to create that checkbox, and we're going to make sure that that goes after the label for reasons you will see shortly. Okay, so that's going to be style.div. And right now, this is going to be empty. We're just going to export this. And again, these components can be named whatever you want. It's good to have them be as informative as possible or as generic, depending on your needs. I think checkbox is a little too specific since we had already made a point of making that input a little bit more reusable with different input types, but hopefully you can forgive that. So we have this checkbox, which contains a label, which contains an input and span. Each of these contain that. So essentially what we want to happen is when we are inside the checkbox, we focused inside the checkbox, or we're going to use the CSS declaration focus within, we want to affect the label. We want to affect the opacity of that label. So we can do that simply by doing the following. So we're going to reference the parent, in this case checkbox. We're going to add the focus within, and then we're going to immediately reference the immediate label. So we're going to, in the curly braces here, reference the component directly and set the opacity. So the reason we wanted to make sure that the checkbox fell after the label is because we need to reference the label. If the label is defined after, we're not going to have that reference. You're going to get some build errors. So in this case, if I go over here and I focus within, there we go. Ta-da! And now we've satisfied our bonus checkbox.